United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer is testifying in front of the Senate today, less than 24 hours before Donald Trump's April 9th reciprocal tariffs go into effect across the world. Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat, pressed Greer on whether these tariffs will indeed go into effect amid calls from some of the president's allies for a pause. Here's what Greer said.
At page 4 of your testimony, Mr. Greer, you said the president's strategy is already bearing fruit. Well, I can tell you for a lot of Oregonians who have 401ks that are being drained out, that's pretty rotten stuff. And you ought to realize how serious this is for the country. Now, everybody in the administration practically has a different story about the Trump tax hike. So I'm interested in knowing what the story is today. Will higher tariffs go into effect tomorrow as announced?
Senator, yes, they're scheduled to go into effect. We are having negotiations with all kinds of countries at this time. The president's fixed in his purpose. The nature of the emergency that I discussed earlier is not something we can wait on anymore. So we will have the president's plan go into effect, and we're coupling that with immediate negotiations with our partners.
Now, shortly before markets opened and plunged yesterday, Trump posted to Truth Social, quote, "The United States has a chance to do something that should have been done decades ago. Don't be weak, don't be stupid, don't be a panican," parentheses, a new party based on weak and stupid people. Be strong, courageous, and patient, and greatness will be the result. Posts on Trump's feed throughout the day alternated between indicating he would not budge to indicating he was pressuring other countries into better deals. As we discussed here on the show yesterday, I think it's possible, actually likely, that Trump is trying to do both at the same time by sending subtle invitations to negotiate while trying to maintain his bluff. And I don't know if it'll work, and nobody could really be sure about anything right now, but the once sacred relationships between our government, global finance, and other countries are being tested and renegotiated in real time. Heat map correspondent Matthew Zeitlin posted a screenshot of a quote from CNBC that CNBC actually covered from Tom Lee, who Zeitlin described as, quote, probably the biggest bull on the street around noon yesterday. Lee said, quote, "The White House broke a core covenant of capitalism, stable and predictable regulatory environment." That's what I want to ask our guest today about. Is Trump violating core covenants of capitalism? And if so, is that bad? Mark DiPlacido is a policy advisor at American Compass, where in the spirit of disclosure, I'm also a member. Writing the New York Post, DiPlacido said of Trump's new tariff policy, quote, "Advocates for the failed free trade paradigm will cast short-term price increases, stock market fluctuations, and supply chain disruptions as catastrophic, but they ignore the immense costs of their recent strategy. That seems to assume the pain will indeed be, quote, short-term." Mark actually worked as the Deputy Assistant Trade Representative for Public Affairs at the office of the USTR back in Trump's first administration. And American Compass is a major influence on the Trump administration, maintaining close relationships with many of the people currently influencing trade policy. Compass leader Orrin Cass is actually in the New York Times this morning arguing, quote, this is the headline, "Stop freaking out, Trump's tariffs can still work." So let's bring Mark in now to offer his perspective as chaos reigns here in DC. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
One big question right now is, let's just say hypothetically the administration is open to negotiation, and that's a big point of contention, and we could get into all of that, but let's just say hypothetically that is the case. Are there good deals to be struck with particular countries? So like in Australia or Japan, I know American Compass has been pretty supportive of the idea of a 10% tariff just across the board, which went into effect last week. But can we get to better places with some of these countries than where the rates are right now as they go into effect on the 9th?
Sure. So a couple reactions to that question. I think first and foremost, just the influx that we've already seen of these countries reaching out to the United States, wanting a deal as soon as possible. Last week, the number being floated was around 50. Now it's over 70. I think it's very clear that to the extent the president intended to use these tariffs as a point of leverage, they're getting an immediate response, and they're definitely effective. When it comes to individual countries, I think there's a few things that are going to continue to be important benchmarks in negotiations. The founder of American Compass, Orrin Cass, laid a few of these out in a Substack last week. But there's sort of three main metrics. The first is balance, right? And this should really be seen, I think, going forward as the primary benchmark for U.S. trade policy and sort of the long-term goal. The previous trade regime that we've been under for the last 3 decades has been this WTO system of trying to bring all tariff rates down to zero, essentially, and a sort of rules-based system with this sort of pseudo-intellectual or pseudo-international court called the appellate body. We're now moving, I think, to a system where the primary principle is not going to be just a race to the bottom to zero tariffs, but a recognition that balance is the end goal. And the reason that distinction is important is because it's not just tariff rates that determine whether trade is fair and balanced. There's a lot of other non-tariff barriers that countries pursue that distort trade relationships with their trade partners, and that has driven this $1 trillion trade deficit that we have in the United States.
Can you actually tell us more about that, Mark? Because you worked at USTR several years ago, and you probably saw what some of those non-tariff barriers are, and they just sound so abstract to, I think, people outside of the super wonky circles. Oh, a non-tariff barrier.
Yes.
Okay, of course. But what does that actually mean, and what have we actually seen?
Sure. So I'll run through a handful of them. The first thing is currency devaluation. So essentially, if your currency is strong relative to another country's currency, your imports your exports are relatively more expensive. So it disincentivizes other countries from buying your goods if you have a stronger currency. So when countries want to flood the world market with their goods and capture world market share for their manufacturers, what they do is they devalue their currency so that their goods are relatively cheap for us in America and our goods are relatively more expensive. So that's a big one. There's another huge subset of industrial policies that come in the form of industrial subsidies. And these can be both direct payments from the government. These can be state-owned and directed enterprises, which are very common in China. And it can also be window guidance for investment, so that basically manufacturers and producers in a country get a much more than favorable market rate for investment than consumers. What all of these policies are designed to do, I'd also throw in intellectual property theft and wage suppression, discriminatory taxes and regulations, so that American goods have a harder time getting into the market in the first place. Not to mention just general tariffs are higher for the rest of the world than they are in the United States as basically the lowest rates. So what all these policies do in countries that run surpluses, right? So the United States has about $1 trillion trade deficit. China has about $1 trillion trade surplus with the world, I believe. And China's surplus represents about 45% of the world's trade surpluses. The United States deficit represents 78% of the world's trade deficits. Those policies are all designed to suppress consumption in surplus countries so that they can acquire wealth from the United States. So what the deficit essentially means is how I try to explain it in as simple terms as possible. We are consuming about $1 trillion more every year than we're producing. And so in order to purchase those goods, we have two options. We can either buy them on credit, and this comes in usually the form of bonds, either government or private sector, or we sell off our own assets to pay for them. We sell off corporate equity and ownership. We sell off intellectual property. We sell off real estate. And so year over year, as we rack up these trade deficits, our net foreign asset position goes up. Okay, so you think about deficits versus the debt. In terms of fiscal policy, the equivalent would be the trade deficit and the net foreign asset position, which represents how many American assets are owned by foreigners versus how many foreign assets are owned by Americans. That number is now negative $24 trillion. So you think about how much real estate, how many stocks, how many bonds are owned by foreign investors. And you also think about the interest and the value that those assets accumulate over time that would otherwise be going to Americans. And so when the president talks about making America wealthy again, we are seeding our wealth to pay for short-term consumption of cheap foreign goods. And that is not a recipe for wealth. That's not a sustainable path for our country or our economy.
So there's this question of the cost benefit analysis about the tactics, and that's obviously the most controversial aspect of what's happened over the course of the last week. And we don't have to, sort of get into all of the particulars, but just on this big picture question of how long does this need to go on to yield results that are worth the cost of the uncertainty in the market, or the potential price increases, all of that. Is there a point at which the sense of global confusion or whatever, from your perspective, Mark, is no longer worth the potential benefits in forms of better trading relations?
Sure. So I think what we've seen in sort of the media and legacy political reaction to these actions is a fixation on short market or short-term stock market fluctuations as like some sort of benchmark for good economic policy. And I think we really have to move away from that framework as we're looking ahead to the 21st century. So the president himself has stated a few weeks ago that the United States economy oftentimes runs on these quarterly evaluations based on the stock market of our overall health. China sets its economic policy in terms of decades. And what that has allowed China to do is to capture a lot of the strategic industries that are going to define the 21st century. So, 30 years ago, when the United States had leaders really in both parties that were pushing this globalization, this free market paradigm, they basically argued that we would only lose low value industries and low value manufacturing. Instead, what's happened is within that trade deficit, we've seen the United States from the early 90s go from a $40 billion surplus in advanced technology manufacturing, so technologies at the leading edge of the economy, to a $300 billion deficit. So we haven't just lost t-shirts and sneakers, as I'm hearing all over the media in the last couple of weeks. We've lost industries that are key to not just consumers in the 21st century, but our national security as well. We basically make no ships in the United States anymore. China's increased its global share of ship production to about 50% in just the last 5 years because of these long-term policies that China implements. It's went from importing more cars on net to being the largest world exporter of vehicles now. It's captured critical minerals and EVs. It's captured legacy semiconductors, shipbuilding, as I mentioned, a number of other industries that if we were to ever have a conflict, or as we saw it with the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, another just national emergency that requires strong supply chains, the United States is not equipped to handle that situation. And it's just not sustainable in the long term. And so these short-term disruptions, some maybe one-time temporary price increases we might see, although there are other factors that are going to mitigate those as well. They have to be weighed against these longer-term goals of balance and of economic and national security. And a third thing I would add with the advanced technology point as well is our capacity for innovation. Research and development moves with manufacturing. And if we're going to continue to come out with these technologies that define the world economy that Americans have always been so proud to lead on, that's going to be harder and harder the more we offshore these industries as well.
So, Matt Stoller, someone a lot of us respect, argued that Trump's approach is, quote, incredibly stupid and destructive. That's not because tariffs are bad, but because across the board, immediate and high tariffs without any certainty they will continue, combined with zero aid from government to reshore anything and no time to adjust, is a recipe for depression. He's also said that Trump is a psyop for neoliberalism. Why is Matt wrong here, Mark, on the particular question of, he says zero aid from the government to reshore anything and no time to adjust? Like, should there be, from your perspective, from the Compass perspective, from my perspective too, some type of government aid to reshore and to augment these policies? What might that look like?
Sure. So Oren had an article in the New York Times this morning, sort of laying out a response to some of these criticisms. And I think he struck the balance very well. There is a need for somewhat of an adjustment period to make sure we can reshore production as quickly to fill demand as
Hmm.
possible, right? I think that a 10% immediate tariff is definitely reasonable and something that should have already been factored into the market when Trump was elected, right? As far as the president being, a closeted neoliberal or something like that, I think we see from the picks in his cabinet and this administration, from the Vice President J.D. Vance to now Secretary Rubio, Bessent, Mirren.
Chavez de
They're
Remer.
singing from a
Yeah.
different songbook than some of the appointees in the first administration, and I think there's a lot more unity behind this larger goal of balance and larger goals of making sure the economy is not just not just stacked for multinational corporations in the stock market, but for everyday Americans. And that's maybe another point I should have touched on earlier again is the trade paradigm we have today has worked very well for some people. And it's not to say that the policy has no trade-offs, but structurally we want to shift to an economy that supports thriving middle class families. And reshoring manufacturing, ensuring we have that trade balance is a good way of doing that versus an economy that is basically incentivized minimizing capital investment as much as possible, or offshoring a lot of that investment and driving wages down to as low as can possibly be found around the world.
Hmm.
We have to give workers, we have to give families a stake in the economy, and not just have an economy built on stock market valuations for the wealthiest 10%.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point because Howard Lutnick got a lot of grief over the weekend for talking about how we're going to bring back the part of the Apple supply chain. He used this example of the iPhone screws, and Oren did an interesting debate with Ro Khanna on Breaking Points recently about that. And I wanted to get your take, Mark, on what reasonably can be reshored, and if these are, to paraphrase the criticism, jobs Americans will do.
Yeah. So I didn't see the whole Lutnick interview, but I think I saw the portion that Oren was in on the other podcast. What I imagine Lutnick was referring to was years ago, Apple talked about moving back to the United States, opening a plant in Texas. And the excuse they basically gave was that we didn't have specialty manufacturing in the United States enough to make these custom minor screws that go into the
Hmm.
iPhone. I think the point the congressman was making is that is a low value piece of the phone. But if that was what hung up reshoring the entire industry, it is a problem. We don't have precision manufacturing in the United States, and that's something that would have wider repercussions for the industrial base, and the industrial base has wider implications for the defense industrial base if we ever God forbid, get into another conflict. And so I think when we're thinking about the value of industries, it's not the final price of a 3-cent screw or something. It's the price of not having the capacity to scale up and make something like that in the event of an
Hmm.
emergency or a severe supply chain
Hmm.
disruption. It's also just the technological know-how, right? I mean, these are basic capacities that demand is not going to fall for. And something I've sort of been thinking about as I've fielded a lot of these questions, even on the low valuing manufacturing front, is there's basic demand that's going to continue to be built into our
Hmm.
economy, right? Like our basic needs as human beings don't change, even as even as the legal field expands, as healthcare expands, as education continues to get government funding, as we have this whole digital world that's now mapped on top of the physical world. We still need clothing. We still need food. We still need defense. We still need housing, healthcare. We have basic needs as human beings that don't change, and completely ceding our capacity to plug into that part of the economy, I think, is foolish and goes against basic civilizational instincts. The last thing I would say is that manufacturing has spillover effects to the wider economy and to services. And this was a point I think Rokana raised and agreed with Orrin and our general take on is I think there's a 3 or 4 times multiplier effect for manufacturing to come into a localized economy. And Orrin's fond of using the example of productivity and value increasing in the manufacturing sector spilling over into the services, right? Like haircuts, the barbering services have not really changed over the last 100 years, but you don't pay $5 anymore. You pay, if you're in DC, you pay $50 or $60. If you know, the price of a haircut has risen with the overall value in the economy, and that's not just inflation; it's a reflection that value is being added in the wider economy, and the United States is able to trade goods with other countries. So there's a lot of spillover effects to manufacturing up and down the chain, both on the national security front and on the wider economic front.
And actually, as we're recording this, the last thing I wanted to ask about, Mark, is U.S. Trade Rep Jamison Greer is speaking to the Senate committee right now. And according to Chad Pergram, has said the president's strategy is already bearing fruit. Over the past few weeks, a planned layoff for an auto production shift in Tennessee has been suspended. Another automaker is hiring additional employees and expanding overtime to increase auto production in Indiana. Companies have announced $4 trillion in new investment in the United States. Nearly 50 countries have approached me personally to discuss the president's new policy and explore how to achieve reciprocity. So one of the questions I just wanted to pose is we have also seen layoffs. And so we've seen or announcements about downsizing places like Michigan. So how are you looking at the picture of what's happened over the last week? Is there a net benefit that's become clear, or is that still unclear?
I think I saw the press release. Well, I think there was also a mention of suspended layoffs at some of those auto
Mm-hmm.
plants, and also to the Apple point earlier. I believe Apple's pledged to invest $500 billion into production in the United States. So that's another thing that's countering, I think, these larger trends is that the White House has already highlighted trillions of dollars of pledged investment in the United States, and that's going to counteract, a lot of the disruption. And on net, right, the production is going to redound to the benefit of Americans living here, of more shipping jobs here, of more production jobs here, and the kinds of jobs also that are going to support families, right, that have stable hours and shifts, that have benefits, that provide the kind of stability necessary for a middle class life. The president obviously is also pursuing other pro-growth policies on the deregulatory front, on taxes, on energy production, and like in the first administration, I think that's going to yield a lot of positive benefits. On the tax front, I would also say there's a huge budget shortfall for extending these tax cuts, and tariffs are a way to raise revenue and offset some of those costs. So I think taken as a whole, the president had a balanced view of what a good economic policy suite would look like that supports the country broadly and importantly raises working and middle class wages even faster than the wages of people at the
I do
top.
have one more question, and it's a silly one, but it is just like, how is USTR juggling all of these? Like, you've been inside there. How are they communicating with so many different countries right now on the
Yeah.
particulars of these like really niche trade relationships? It seems like a remarkable feat to have to deal with.
Yeah, and for a small agency, I'm sure it's all hands on deck. One thing I imagine that's helping them is they do put together an annual report that really lists pretty extensively all of the trade barriers and unfair practices that the United States finds other countries um, participating in, and so they do have sort of a handbook. They handed those out at the event in the Rose Garden last week, and have sort of been presenting it in different interviews that I've seen over the last week. So they have somewhat of a guide, somewhat of a documentation, I guess, of what potential asks could be, and a lot of them are people who've worked at the agency for a long time and are very knowledgeable. So and Jameson is fantastic, and I'm so excited to see him in the role that he's in. So
Well, Mark, thank you for your insights. This is super helpful. We really appreciate it.
thank you, Emily. Appreciate you having me.
Appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you watch on YouTube, and over at undercurrents.tv, you get the full premium experience of the show, special episodes just for paying subscribers, weekly email list from me, and all kinds of other great stuff from Unheard. I don't know if you caught this yesterday, but the market started climbing after a fake news post was published on social media by a guy who had Bloomberg. Some of you know him if you spend time on X. A guy who had Bloomberg in his handle, so people sort of assume that maybe he works at Bloomberg or something like that. He posted as Kevin Hassett, one of Trump's economic advisors, was on Fox News, that Hassett had indicated an interest in the 90-day pause that Bill Ackman, billionaire hedge fund guy Bill Ackman, had asked the Trump administration, or had suggested the Trump administration pursue. And markets start climbing when this 90-day pause is potentially part of the equation. And what's really, I mean, there are a million things that are interesting about that. The way that people's fortunes are affected minute by minute because of things that are on social media that are unverified. I mean, this stuff is, you could spend hours just dealing with that in and of itself. But one of the things that strikes me as really noteworthy is if you're Donald Trump and you see that, you realize that at some point, and this may or may not be true, but you realize at some point you could maybe just flip that switch. And when you flip that switch, these stock losses that people are panicking over, and rightfully so, we talked about that yesterday, can be almost reversed. That's an important thing to keep in mind here, because Donald Trump probably sees that as a significant point of leverage. And that weird little fluctuation yesterday, I bet that is sticking in the minds of people who are working on this just blocks away over at the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Again, I'm not saying it's a good strategy. We could have a separate discussion about that. I'm not saying it's the right strategy. I'm not saying it'll work, but I'm saying I think it's worth acknowledging that is their strategy. They are maintaining this bluff because they realize they believe they can get good deals. And it might be a month from now. It might be 3 weeks from now. It might be a couple of months from now. And all of the pain that people felt in that time period because of the markets, they probably think that they can flip the switch back. And that's pretty interesting because there may be an argument, at least as it relates to the stock markets, and this is separate from jobs and wages, and production, manufacturing, and all of that. But at least as it relates to the stock market, which people in media are disproportionately invested in, and in these elite spaces are disproportionately invested in compared to the rest of the country, although people's pensions and retirement savings are obviously going to be very affected by it, no matter who you are. But people in media and elite spaces are disproportionately invested in the stock market and interested in the stock market, tied to the stock market. And so all of this panic, they may think they have a way to sort of deal with that quickly and get better trade deals in the process, without some of the short-term pain from the markets lasting in the long term. So interesting time, interesting testimony from Jameson Greer today. And it was great to have Mark, who actually worked in the USTR office in Trump 1 as they were dealing with USMCA and all of that, here to talk us through the perspective that is reaching people who are working in those spaces. So thank you for tuning in. Appreciate it. And we will be back here on another busy news week with more Undercurrents soon.